Welcome to another episode of Fair Folk at Work. You know, if my next guest were God, you'd probably be in his religion. I'm talking, of course, about my good friend, Greg Moore. Hey, Greg.
Hey Dan, how are you today?
I am doing just acres of swell. I'd like to start with the traditional first Fair Folk at Work question, which is who was the person who said to you, there's this thing called fair, and what did they say to get you to go out there?
Well, my parents took myself and my brother to the fair when I was about 10 or 11 years old, one of the very first fairs out in Agoura. And I can remember it being blazing hot and wandering around in the dust. I specifically remember seeing the rope ladder that was impossible to climb, but being a small child going like, oh, that looks totally easy, and convincing my parents to pony up whatever amount of money it required to participate and instantly spinning over. But as a small child going out to the fair, it was a really fun experience. Then when I was 15, my brother and I heard that the fair was going on and we thought to ourselves, oh, well, we should get costumes together. And in the paper, there was an ad that the Living History Center over at Home Silk Shop was doing a costume workshop. So you go over and they gave you patterns and told you what to buy, and you could make yourself a costume. So we went there and I met somebody by the name of Kevin Brown and Cheryl. I forget Cheryl's last name, but we talked to them after the little workshop was over. And they said, oh, we're having a workshop next weekend at the Museum of Science and Industry. So my brother and I went to that. And once again, we talked to Kevin and a few other people at that one. And they said, we're having a workshop this coming Wednesday, a language workshop at Barnsdale Park. And so, of course, we went off to that one. Once again, saw several of the same people doing the workshops, and they said, oh, well, this weekend we're doing workshops out at the Paramount Ranch. You guys should just come out and, do the workshops. All of this was in the auspices of just that we were going to attend the fair. We had zero intention of working the fair. But I believe there were 3 or 4 workshop weekends out at Paramount Ranch that we attended. And at the end of that fourth weekend, somebody handed us a pass. And we were all of a sudden working the fair. But it was really a strange happenstance rather than anything that was intended. At that point, you were encouraged to join a guild.
Which group did you fall into?
I think that very first one, I was mostly with the peasants, maybe a little bit with the parade guild. Very early on, I started doing the halberdiers,
Mm-hmm.
and then we all started doing shows together. And that lasted pretty much the entirety of my fair experience. And I think the fair really was quite a bit like a family. And I will say that many people that I met at the fair are lifelong friends.
Other than the rope ladder, what else do you remember about those early fair experiences?
As worker or as being a small child and visiting?
I would say let's move forward to your first years actually working there. What are your sort of memories of how did your body feel? What did you respond to? What shows, foods, games did you play that you enjoyed? That kind of stuff.
Well, Agura was hot. So it was hot.
In a
Uh,
word, you're saying it was hot.
it was very hot, but it was colorful and it was different. You really were able to kind of escape as a child or as a kid. You got to escape into this other world and learn some about history. In the beginning, Phyllis and Ron Patterson, the originators of the fair, Phyllis was a teacher, and they had a real interest in history, and they wanted the right colors of clothing. They wanted people to do their best to speak in Elizabethan. You were trying to immerse yourself, or they wanted the experience for the customers to be immersive. And I think it really was. I think not only was it immersive for the customers, but I think for the participants, the
What
colors,
part of
clothing, the
being,
noise, the
Mhm.
food, it was different.
You got paid in food tickets, right?
Yes, we got like 2 food tickets a day, I think, which really didn't go very far. But you know, the fair, at least for me, even though occasionally we made a little bit of money, it was not about money. It was having fun and entertaining other people, especially when doing shows, making people laugh. That was something that I quite enjoyed.
Do you remember what $2 in food tickets could buy you?
No idea. But I will say that the thing that you typically did is made friends with people at food booths, because then you could eat.
Do you remember, first of all, what your bear name was and how you got it?
Well, I typically went by Bob Wall. That was given to me when we all were in the Halberdiers. And David Springhorn came up and said, "You look like a Bob, Bob Wall." And that was it. And it pretty much stuck.
Can you remember any other shows from that time that you weren't in that you enjoyed and modeled yourself after, kind of thing?
I don't know if I modeled after it, but I think everybody looked forward to things like the Wizard Show and the Commedia shows. Those were, the big main stage shows.
Does any particular scene or actor or moments you remember thinking to yourself, wow, that's really cool. I could kind of do that.
Some of the people that were doing the shows were quite physically capable of stunts. And, I don't think I was ever that gymnastic. But, I can remember seeing people jump off of or sail off of staircases or second stories off of people's shoulders, and just a variety of very physical acting or very physical
Right.
comedy. And I think a lot of our shows, strived for a lot of physical comedy too.
One of the memories I have of you, were you the one who introduced to the rest of us the mother bit?
I very possibly could have. I do not remember the creation of the mother bit, but I think that a lot of times, we saw things that were successful. I don't remember a lot of other people doing the mother bit though.
I don't remember seeing it before you brought it to us. Now, for those of you who are perhaps too young to remember the mother bit, one thing we used to like to do before a show is filter among the audience, meeting, greeting, and hey, how's your day going? That kind of thing. And at one point, Greg would point to a female, usually sitting with her boyfriend. Greg would go, could it be? And then if someone else would go, could it be? And then we'd all
Is it
yell,
possible?
Could it possibly be mother? And then we'd all, about 5 or 6 of us, would make a beeline for this poor lady just sitting on a hay bale. And we'd all start, mother, it's mother. And we'd all pat her on the head. And then we'd start the mother song, which I still remember, which is, oh, I like to hear
Hear my
my mother
mother
talking
talking
early in
early
the
in the
morning.
morning,
And I
and I
like to
like
hear my
my
mother
mother.
talking, even though she's
She's
boring.
boring, and it's
And
all for the life of our mother dear, and to ramble in the new moon. Hey, hey!
hey, and then we'd do this big jazz welcoming thing. And then we'd rip off our caps and say, mother
Allowance.
allowance. And that always got a laugh. Yeah, then I think it was you that would always break it and say something like, that can't be our mother.
You're not
This
our
lady,
mother. Our
this
mother
lady,
wouldn't sharpen her teeth, or
yes,
something,
yeah,
along those lines. And
right.
we would point to a different, unassuming spectator and go through the entire act again,
But much quicker.
abbreviated.
Yeah. And then sometimes if we were really looking for time after going through it the first time, we'd say, this lady is a liar or a thief or something. She has shamed the audience. We must, and then we get the whole audience to go, shame on you, neener,
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 neener.
neener.
And that would always get a laugh. So, any rate,
Yeah, it was, a lot of that, the pre show or quote unquote pre show, was that there was always turnover on the stages, typically, unless it was a really hot day and you had a shady seating area for people. And so you really needed, 5 or 10 minutes to kind of try and make some hubbub and commotion to get people to sit down, or else you were pretty much performing to empty hay bales. So that was the impetus of most of the pre-shows that we were doing, something to make noise and get people interested in sticking around.
that's another point of this podcast is that the fair gave us an audience willing to play and was wanting to play and sort of expected the actors to descend upon them en masse for no apparent reason, and then just sort of leave them alone, but give them a sense of being in the show as well.
Well, I think that was one of the goals of the Renaissance Fair at that time, was to be immersive. So you weren't necessarily just up there to pontificate, you really wanted to involve people. And so some of those things in the beginning, whether it was bringing them in, before the show started, or like some of our shows where we would get a volunteer from the audience and embarrass them for 15 minutes up on stage, it brought them in, and typically people really enjoyed it.
I like to think in some ways that we did things that scarred people for life. You
Yeah.
know,
I mean, some of the things, it was really a different time. I look back at some of the shows and you probably wouldn't get away with doing them these days. But at the time, it was fine to pull up a guy out of the audience who was 6'8" and put him in a skirt and throw a pair of safety breasts on him and a big cone princess hat and make them skip around the stage. I think people in the audience probably enjoyed that more than, seeing us. It was seeing somebody taken out of their normal being a patron, being, sitting on the hay bale, being thrust into the middle of a show.
I remember when we were coming up with King Arthur that you very strongly insisted upon making Guinevere an audience member. And even more ideally, Guinevere should be a guy.
Which would be historically accurate, would it not? Because, men typically played the female parts way back when. But we did it for yucks. It was all for the laughs. So King Arthur was one of my favorite shows. Incredibly silly, rhyming show. I think of it a lot of like a kid's show that adults would enjoy. But, we tried every conceivable person for Guinevere. Sometimes we would grab a woman out of the audience and they were embarrassed to wear the pair of safety breasts. And like I said, I don't think we would get away with, doing what we did all those many years ago, because, there were a couple of times where children were pulled up on stage and, you'd put them in the skirt and the skirt would, come up underneath their armpits, and the safety breasts would hang almost down to their knees. And I think we only did that a couple of times, but you probably would not be able to do that now.
I remember your reaction to Guinevere, look at this, you must treat her to a kiss or whatever, strip down the bag that's revealing, and then you go, oh, no, 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 which actually works really well no matter who is being revealed as Guinevere. So that was an excellent, whenever Guinevere was revealed, what was your sort of technique for dealing with it?
Well, I mean, it really varied, but typically it was that whole no, 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 none, and you know, not gonna do it. And depending on how playful the person was, sometimes a hand would go over there if it were, a great big guy, put my
Right.
hand over their mouth and then kiss my hand. Most of the time, you were able to just back out and go, oh, no, 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 and this is a family show or something. And get away with not kissing anybody. And I will say that one time there was a friend who got pulled up, and so I planted a great big kiss right on his mouth. The audience really loved it. Every show was different because there was a member of the audience in the show.
And I guess it made it easier once Doreen got into the role of narrator, and if push came to shove, you could kiss her.
That was always an option.
Right.
Or Doreen could kiss Guinevere.
Right.
We always had a way out. There was a lot of improvising, even though the shows were fixed. uh Anytime there's audience members, you don't necessarily know where things are going to go.
Well,
So
I would disagree a little bit in that you know the beginning of the bit and you know how it ends. You don't know how it's going to get there. So it appears a lot more spontaneous. We are actually kind of in control of what's going on.
I just meant by that you can't tell what your participants reaction is going to be, because sometimes once they got up on the stage, they didn't really care for being there. And there were several shows where we ripped the costume off of them and grabbed somebody else out of the audience. You have a wild card, and sometimes your wild card, your audience member, was fantastic and it made the show better, and sometimes they were okay and the show was still really funny. And on those few occasions where they just would have none of it, they were disrobed, and we got a different volunteer.
For me, the go, no go moment was when the audition got to the part of our Guinevere must be able to scream very, very loudly. And if Guinevere did not respond to getting his hands getting raised up by Doreen, I remember looking over at Doreen and the two of you guys, Mark and, well, you, and saying, instead of saying, my lords and ladies, Guinevere, I would say, my lords and ladies, what we need is a new volunteer. Huzzah! And then you and Mark would strip the costume off the volunteer and then go searching into the audience for a new volunteer while Doreen and myself were babbling on stage about what we were looking for in a volunteer.
And all of it was supposed to be fun. And that's why typically, if you got a guy up there who was 6'6" and 300 pounds, as long as they went along with it, it was hysterical. But if you got that person up there who would have none of it, you had a very large person, that you kind of needed to be careful with because you couldn't tell where it was going to go.
I
Um,
remember one show where there was this like 13-year-old boy in the front row who, like, we said, what we need is stomp a volunteer. And for that second that we said volunteer, his whole face lit up and he looked great. And so, like, usually you and Mark would be the ones who jumped off stage, and Adam and I or Doreen and I would be a volunteer, what a wondrous thing, all that kind of stuff. And then you got him on stage and he like wilted. I mean, it was just like the most lack of energy lump of flesh that has ever been on the stage. And so we all kind of looked at each other and said, what we need is another volunteer. But what's funny, the next show after us, and I don't remember what it was, also needed a volunteer. And they also picked the same kid who did the exact same thing. I mean, they didn't have the courage to throw him back. And so they were sort of stuck with this lump in the middle of the show. We got pretty good, if not necessarily picking the right person, but going with the person who is ultimately going to work for us.
We did the show for many years, and I think with the many years, we just gained experience of one, being up on stage and talking, not having stage fright. You know, sometimes there would be 5 people in the audience, and sometimes there would be 600. We would put all our energy into it, whether it was 5 or 600. But you did gain the experience of figuring out who you thought would make a good volunteer. They weren't really volunteering. I mean, we volunteered them. That was, part of the joke. Uh, you know,
I often pass along the wisdom that when you're looking for a volunteer, you see the person who's pointing to the person next to them. And so you pick that guy because that
exactly.
always
That's
gets a little.
one of the things I was going to mention. Exactly. Anybody who was pointing out their friend, hey, pick this one, pick this one. You pick the person who's doing the pointing. It's kind of a double joke.
The other role I'd like to ask you about comes from the Commedia.
Hmm.
You were God at the
I
very
did
end.
play God. I don't know how many people got to play God at the Renaissance Fair, but that was one of my favorite parts, and it was a relatively brief part. I had 2 parts in that show. I played Pedrolino, who was the Commedia is the Italian comedy and has some set figures like Arlecchino and a variety of different
Isabella and
exactly set people. And our Commedia, we ended it having God turn up to make everything right. Playing God was pretty darn entertaining, and people seemed to enjoy it too.
I think of all the laughs we got in all the shows, you coming out and saying, because we set it up that we're all about to get slaughtered by Capitano,
Correct.
and we're saying, oh God, please save us now.
I would turn up and say, I am a god. And, something silly about like, you see that tree? I made it that tree. And then, we would turn Capitano into a dog and save all of our people, and everything was right with the world. It was fun. It was fun to play God.
You often exited going through the audience as God, saying, you see that tree? You like it, that tree? I made it. It never ceased to amuse me that as you exited, you were sort of going through a genial sort of, life is good.
I tried to be a good God.
Yeah.
So,
Like I said, if you actually had a church or something, I'd consider going. It was
and you were talking earlier about shows that influenced us. I think one of the reasons we did a Commedia was because having seen Commedias performed before at the
right.
at the fair. I'm not sure. I think that year we might have been the only Commedia playing, whereas there was almost always a Commedia out at fair.
I think our Commedia leaned more towards Looney Tunes or Bugs Bunny than the actual Renaissance.
I think most of our shows uh, tended to be inspired by Warner Brothers, Looney Tunes, Bugs Bunny, and the Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner. I think one of the things I was proud of is that our shows tended to be family friendly. And even, we've mentioned that in the King Arthur show, we had the safety breasts. They were made out of paper
Paper
mache.
mache and hanging from a string, and
Yeah,
they were
and
bare.
exactly. That was the most risque part of, I think, any show that I did. I mean, we had other props like somebody would lose a leg or you'd scream owie and prop chopped off leg would go flying onto stage. I still considered that pretty family friendly because all the violence was all cartoon violence, not very much like Three Stooges violence.
I think another reason why we came off the way we did and were so popular with kids was that we basically came across as big kids playing at being on stage. So no one ever came up to me and said, "What are your plans for legitimate theater next
Oh
week?"
no.
And like the horses were obviously hobby horses. The heads were burlap and the broomstick body. I mean, basically, we were just obviously kids playing.
Definitely had people, both old and young, that would watch our shows over and over and over and over again. I always enjoyed seeing some of the same people over and over again in the audience.
One of the traditional fair folk at work questions is, have there been times in life when you've taken the confidence you have gathered on stage at fair and applied it to real life outside of fair?
Well, I think, and I don't know that I would necessarily attribute it to fair, but I'll just say I do. I always thought I could do anything. If you can get up on stage and make a fool of yourself in front of 600 people, then you can pretty much do anything you put your mind to. It was interesting. I don't think I ever had stage fright. I was never the best at lines. Like sometimes I struggled a little. Even the shows we did that were rhyming, I think, were significantly easier. I think the feeling that you can pretty much have the confidence to try things, to do things. So my child went through grade school, and there was a garden, and one of the things we did was do stone soup. So in my full Renaissance costume, I went from classroom to classroom collecting vegetables to make the stone soup, and then in costume the following week with other parents, obviously, we made giant batches of soup to serve all the kids. One, it was a good way to embarrass my son turning up in his classroom in a full Renaissance fair costume and talking with a silly English made up accent. But once again, I think performing in front of other people, especially if you were shy or nervous or anything, it sort of gave you confidence that you could pretty much do anything. And I always seem to have that, oh, I can do that. The sink is backed up, I can fix that. That's not a problem. Whether it goes horribly awry or not is something completely different. Just having the confidence that you can try things, that you can, something I learned very young and probably out at the fair.
I think I agree. Part of the way the fair was set up by Ron and Phyllis is they were coming out of a theater movement that involved breaking down the fourth wall, and that if you invite an audience member into the show, you make it that they are part of the show and they cannot fail. As a consequence, we basically were in an environment that just rewarded going out there and trying something silly. You are likely to encounter someone who's going to give you applause or positive feedback.
Yeah. And, a lot of the stuff, at least in the beginning, whether it was the halberdiers or parades, you were really doing things in the streets. And I think that, subsequent to the fair being sold, um, and now it's a rather large conglomerate, um, I think they've pretty much gotten away from most all of the street performers, and uh, I couldn't even say how much they're doing on stage now. It seems to be much more focused on the food and shopping and things like that, rather than uh, what I think the dream of Ron and Phyllis, which was much more of a historical or um, involving the people, and getting
Right.
in their face, right? People walk in the front gate and there were people holding things in front of your face, whether it was a severed pig's head or some really smelly cheese or people that were kind of rolling around in the mud. It was, that's just my humble opinion.
Did you have any pre-fair theatrical experience that you were able to draw upon?
I really didn't. All of my experience came from doing fair. I had other interests in my life. I was in scouts and did lots of camping, and occasionally there would be skits that kids would perform in, but never anything to the extent of what we did at the Renaissance Fair. Or, some of the shows we performed other places. You'll remember that for practice, sometimes we would perform out in front of UCLA when you or Mark were going, or Dad was teaching there. Or I can remember we did a show in front of one of the banks down in Westwood. I also did the San Diego Renaissance Fair, which was very short lived. We also performed shows at some retreats that the Pattersons were putting on. The majority of it was at the Renaissance Fair, but there were a few other places where I participated.
Yeah, I don't recall performing specifically at a Patterson retreat, so I might have been at UCLA for real at that point. Have you had any theatrical experiences other than being the hawker for Stone Soup, or have you had any other?
Not of late. Not of late.
As I recall, you worked sort of as the production manager at a print shop for many years.
Yes, I was in advertising and printing. Um, that's how I spent my career.
Were there any times where you sort of drew upon your fair, everything will turn out okay vibe on a patron?
I don't know that there was much crossover between my actual work life and what was done at the Renaissance Fair. Like I said, most of my fair experience was not about money, although I did have booths myself. I had partnered with or had percentages in certain booths, whether it was Splatter a Platter, or we did a lot of help with Stromboli booth and the Dueling Buckets. Very close friends, had much more of a financial interest in the fair than I did. We were always there to help out, whether it was at Dueling Buckets or Chicken Pie, the Stromboli booth.
Do you
So
remember any of the hawks you performed for various booths?
I would have to ponder that a little bit. I'll get back to you on that. Some of the things that we did, whether it was a good sales technique or not, sometimes eat things with our bare faces in front of booths. There was the booth that sold, it was kind of like a banana split or like a sundae sort of thing. We'd get 3 or 4 of us in front of the booth that was selling it, and then, announce to everybody that we were going to eat it with our bare faces. And then, it was basically like a pie eating contest where most of the food ended up on your face or on the ground. Once again, it was a little like performance art, but people did seem to enjoy that.
And sales would correspondingly rise in the.
Like I said, I'm not sure if that was a big sales winner or not, but people did seem to enjoy it. So,
I remember just helping out at Splatter Platter.
mhm.
And what I remember thinking was, this is such a stupid idea. No one will ever do it. I mean, it was basically just
Breaking a plate.
breaking a plate. And
Yes.
and
And
I
you could and you could win a tankard, but if the business model was correct, even if they won a tankard throwing the plate, you still made money. Not much, but the tankards were incredibly inexpensive, and with any luck, the plates were incredibly inexpensive. And one of the funniest things to do was if somebody would come up and hand you a $20 bill, you would hand them 20 plates. Or, if the plates were $2 a piece, you'd hand them 10 plates and they'd, look at you quizzically, but then they would throw, all the plates and they would never give you an argument. So we were always upselling people. That was another thing. That didn't work as well at like food booths. People wouldn't expect to be handed 17 chicken pies, but Splatter Platter was one of those where, if somebody handed you a big bill, you would just hand them a whole bunch of plates to throw.
There was a certain amount of carny clever to some of the booths at the fair.
I would say a lot of even the shows, and much like carnies or what you would think of as kind of a cheesy carnival, convincing people to play more. I mean, one of the booths that I had was a dunk tank. That was funny because you would taunt people, telling them that they couldn't throw. And if they did sink you, you would just yell at them saying, that was just luck. You can't do that again. Basically conning them out of their money. And you didn't care because it was hot and you were getting wet.
Who else worked at the dunk tank booth?
Saw worked at that also. We did that one at San Diego Fair.
And who was the ownership of Splatter Platter?
Mostly Kevin. It was Kevin and Vic. I had a teeny part at one part. Once again, I wasn't really in it for money. Most of my involvement in booths was helping build, helping run, not a huge financial interest.
If I were to ask you 5 adjectives to describe fair, what would they be?
Now I have to remember what an adjective is. But
just don't worry about what an adjective. Just
no. I just meant like I'm just trying to think about my experience of the fair, and it was an awesome part of my youth. Things that come to mind that aren't necessarily an adjective, though. It's like a family. Being at the fair was truly like an extension of family. And there was a lot of love, actually, I would say. It was, especially when you were young, it was kind of living an adventure. It was being able to pretend you could literally live kind of a different life, 180 degrees from what your life might be, whether you were going to school or whatever was going on at home. The fair was just a different, magical, colorful, special, intriguing kind of place to grow up. And that's part of what was going on, is we were all growing up out there. I may not have started as a teeny child, although my first memory is being, quite young and being taken there. But, we were still kids when we turned up, and we really grew up at the fair. And I ended up meeting my wife at the fair. So, the importance of what the fair meant to us cannot really be overstated.
Can I
How's
ask
that?
a different question?
Sure.
How do you evaluate fair as a place to bring up your kid?
Well, I think I can't speak to what it would be like now. Back in the day, to me, it seemed like an incredibly safe place. The fair was kind of, so when I got involved in the fair, it would have been the mid 70s. And so the quote unquote 60s, lasted up until kind of the mid 70s, or, thereabouts, early 70s anyway. But the Renaissance Fair was kind of a holdover. There was a lot of what you would quote unquote kind of say hippie culture. It attracted a lot of very creative type people. And um, and to me, growing up there, it always felt incredibly safe. I never felt ill at ease like walking around at night. that was one of the other special things that, I don't think that anybody who's working the fair now necessarily has the experience that we had, which is, we would arrive at the fair on Friday night or even afternoon sometime, and we wouldn't leave until Sunday night. So we lived on the fair site for the weekend, and there were those that were working the fair or worked for the company that lived on fair site. But, we were basically camping for the weekend. So those 6 or 8 weekends a year, we spent doing fair during the day and then spending the evenings with our friends, whether it was watching a night show or sitting behind somebody's booth with somebody playing a guitar. It was even more magical after the fair was over and it was nighttime than during the actual fair. You weren't performing anymore. You weren't on the street interacting with people. You were hanging out with your friends in this kind of magical place that was the Renaissance Fair.
Let me hit you with a counterfactual and ask you, if you lived in a world without a Renaissance fair, how do you think your life would have turned out?
Well, I would like to think that my life would have been a happy, good life. I think that my circle of friends just would have been significantly different. I think one of the really interesting things about having started the fair way back when, the people, my friends from the fair, really were my social group. I still see and talk to those people, or at least some of those people, more so than anyone from college or anyone from high school or grade school. I have the friends that I have that I went to high school with that I'm still in contact did the fair with me. So if I hadn't done the fair, I just would have had a very different social group than I do even to this day.
Who did you go to high school with that also did fair?
Well, Kevin Emery, who, he did shows with us and also did dueling buckets. He and Saw had dueling buckets. Then there were several people that were involved with dueling buckets that also came from our high school.
I'm kind of running out of things to say, but when you were kind enough to say, yes, uh, let's talk, was there a part of your brain that went, I gotta be sure to mention blah, blah, blah? So this is your time to talk about blah, blah, blah.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think I mentioned how I got involved and that it was just by happenstance. And then you were sort of forced to try and find your place at the fair. I think I tried a lot of different things, which I'm not sure that everybody did because we're involved in the Halberdiers, which I don't know if you've talked about that on your show, but it was, a motley paramilitary group, all for yucks that we would march around the fair and do street performance carrying pikes. That was a fun thing to do. I also did country dancing for a while, which, I thought was fun. I did more Morris dancing than country dancing, but once I got involved with the stage shows, that's really what stuck. Also, having friends that had booths and being involved with putting up the booths and helping when they needed help and tearing down the booths, that became a big part of doing the fair. I would say, also I was very lucky in that although I didn't really know, I mean, I've met Phyllis Patterson and Ron, any number of times. I didn't know them. They weren't really my friends, but I was lucky that I got to know Kevin Patterson and his wife Leslie, and Leslie did shows with us. It was really special being their friends and still being their friends and having that kind of a closeness to the beginnings of the fair, having the Pattersons as your friend, kind of it made you feel special at the fair. And I think one of the things that I was kind of blessed with is that whether it was doing the performances with you and Mark and Adam and Kevin and the myriad of other people that we did shows with, that doing the fair was, it made me feel special. It was really, I'm not particularly religious, but I would say that it turned out to really be a blessing in life, and the fair really touched me, I think.
Do you want to leave it at that? I think that's a good ending point.
Sure, let's leave it at that.
Let me find the stop recording button. That's my August 2024 interview with Mr. Greg Moore. If you have an account on Spotify, go there and find a playlist called Greg Moore Speaks, and you'll hear Greg in some of his most dramatic roles. If you'd like me to pass along a message to Greg, you can email me at djng@earthlink.net. Questions or comments about the podcast itself can also be emailed to me at djng@earthlink.net. Finally, if you or somebody you know would like to be a guest on Fair Folk at Work, you can email me at djng@earthlink.net. I'm your host, Dan McLaughlin, and that's it for this episode of Fair Folk at Work. That's it for this time. Thanks for listening. Bye bye.